Welcome to Maintainable, the podcast where we explore the art, and sometimes the mess, of software that lasts. We talk to seasoned practitioners who have wrestled with technical debt, untangled legacy code, and helped teams build sustainable, resilient systems. Because good software isn't just about shipping fast, it's about making it last. I'm your host, Robbie Russell. On this episode, I'm joined by Freedom Dumlao, CTO at Vestmark. We talk about maintaining a 20-year-old Java monolith that supports over $1.6 trillion in assets. That's a lot of money. Can't even wrap my head around it. Why psychological safety is just as critical as code quality, and how AI is helping his team make sense of legacy systems. He also shares why he prototypes in Ruby and Rails, and the surprising story of replatforming from microservices back to a monolith. Seems to be a theme these days. Freedom joins us from Wakefield, Massachusetts. Freedom Dumlao, we're so glad to have you join us on Maintainable. Welcome.
Thanks so much. It's great getting a chance to be here with you. You know, I think you and I first met in Detroit, and I got to have my first slice of Detroit-style pizza, actually, with you. That was great.
That was great. Thank you for buying my pizza that night. I really appreciated that. I got to meet some of former coworkers. It was a good time. That was, for everybody listening, they were there for RailsConf 2024. That was my first time in Detroit too, as an adult, actually. Now that I remember, I went there once as a kid because I had some family that lived in Detroit. Anyhow, let's get on with the show. All right, Freedom. So given your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
That's a fantastic question. And I knew you were going to ask it, so I thought about it a lot. And the more I thought about it, the more characteristics came up. But I'd say, not looking at the software itself, but looking at the team and the culture of the team that is responsible for that software tells you a lot about the quality of the maintenance of that software. So there's a principle that I learned when I worked at Amazon. It was a phrase I learned, I think, pretty early on, which is respect what came before. When you're working on a software system that's, been around a while, there's going to be a lot of decisions in there that you look at with fresh eyes and say like, oh my gosh, why would I ever have built it that way? Or what crazy person would write it in that way? And the reality is, you can't possibly know the context that existed at that time. You don't know what was in the mind of the person who was making the decision to do that. And if they were making some compromise, they probably knew they were making a compromise. So let's trust the engineers that came before us. Let's trust that they did the best they could with the context they have and respect that instead of deciding they were idiots and let's go rewrite everything. Respect what they've done and then see how we can build on that going forward. And that helps out a lot too, because, where I work now, we've got software engineers who've recently joined, but I've also got some people on the team who've been building this same system for 20 years. And I know that these guys are brilliant, and I know that they've got the best intentions of the system at heart. And so the software that they've built previously in this system, they built it trying to build something great, and it's so easy for a new person to come in. I think another characteristic, maybe a cliche, but obviously tests. If you look at a system that is well tested, and that's going to be everything from unit tests all the way up to system and integration tests, and even with ideally some manual test plans as well for those really unique cases, a system that has those in place tends to be software that is well maintained and easy to reason about, because you get this great lens to look at the software and how it works if you look at it through the eyes of the tests. I think Jason Sweat says this all the time, which is that your tests are a really great way to define the specification of how your system should work. Use your tests as specs, which is why the name of some systems are what they are, like RSpec, for example. But that's a great characteristic and something I look for to make that determination of whether or not it's well-maintained software.
I'm curious about, I know that you joined the company you're at now, and you'd mentioned, previously working at Amazon and in between there and stuff like that as well. We can get into that, some stories there. But, for someone that's been at your current organization for maybe a little less than a half a year, but at this point, software project that's being well maintained for 20 years, and you're bringing in new people into that, Is it really just as simple as like go look at the tests to understand how the system works? Like, is that how when it comes like people will talk about like tests will be a really effective way to do that. A lot of people listening may be working on teams that have inadequate testing, very little testing, or they're not sure how to even start introducing it later. Do you know if one that project like that primary part of your stack there has always had that, or was there at some point a big initiative to like we need to solidify this a bit more now that we know what we're actually going to be doing with this product versus like from day one? Because not everybody has that kind of like, well, I wish we would have done that early on.
Yeah, I can say with certainty the system did not start out that way, or perhaps it did, but then experienced a period of time where, writing and keeping testing and tests, automated tests especially, wasn't the most critical area of focus for this system as it was evolving. At some point in the past, somebody whoever they are, they deserve a big hug from me, recognized the value in improving the automated tests and why that would be a good thing, and led an effort to increase test coverage massively across the system. Now, the interesting thing I'll say is that you can use our tests to understand how the system behaves for sure, but how it works isn't exactly clear from just looking at the tests. And that's because there's some very, very complex algorithms that exist in this system, and why you would choose one path over the other in the algorithm really depends quite a lot on factors that are impossible to see through the lens of the tests. Sometimes it's an active market condition. Sometimes it's a particular client and how that client has maybe their tolerances for certain scenarios is more liberal than others. So you've got all these various decisions that have to be made throughout the system. And so we can specify the behavior, but the algorithms themselves still have some subject matter expertise wrapped around it. And we depend greatly on those engineers who have been with us for a long time, as well as those who are understudying those folks to become masters of those systems as well.
It sounds like, even just saying understudies, it sounds like you make a very intentional effort to disseminate or share that knowledge base. And I think a lot of times organizations or development teams will kind of get into this situation where they'll talk about like, hey, what if something bad happens, like there's the buzz factor issue, whatever. And so we're like, what are we going to do about that? But then as things pop up and like there's constrained time, and then who seemingly gets passed to the work to continue working on that thing? This is the person that might be the most efficient or the quickest to get in and out of it because we've got other things to deal with right now. And then they go deal with that, and then you don't always get that extra exposure. Everybody talks about expanding the exposure, but what are some ways that you've actually seen be effective on actually making sure that you do that as a team?
So you have to be intentional about it. Absolutely. So, and for us, that effort is largely led by our chief architect, a guy named Dennis Scheckler. He's one of those folks that I mentioned before that's been, part of this company and one of the original developers on this system for the last 2 decades. And for him, it's important that what he knows is something that somebody else knows so that he can eventually, choose to spend his time doing something else. Although we're grateful to have him, and I hope he chooses to stay working on this as long as he can. So it's a system that he really, I think, kicked off and implemented and got started. And, recently he came with a proposal to expand that even more. And I think it's a really good idea to intentionally say we're going to pair 1 or 2 people with a key subject matter expert so that we can ensure that the knowledge that subject matter expert has is going to continue. And then the way that you do that is you take the work that might be getting assigned to that subject matter expert, and you have, the shadow or the mentee in this case do the work with a lot of guidance and oversight from the subject matter expert. That works really well. And then eventually you get to this level of trust where you can say, now Sugantha is capable of taking on these very complex tasks from our system and handling them herself without the oversight. And then we go and grab another mentee and put them in the rotation.
Seems straightforward enough. Why do you think it's hard for some teams to get to that point?
It's tricky in the same way that certain things are always tricky, which is that you've got to figure out what your priorities are. right? If I've got, just going into the simplest version of this, if I've got two engineers that could each do their own thing, then I might choose to go do two different things right now, right? In order to progress my roadmap. But a long-term vision is going to tell me, I should have engineer B shadowing engineer A while we do one task, so that in the future, engineer B is also capable of doing these kinds of tasks. But it's tough to make that call in the face of competition and in the face of, smaller budgets than software teams were dealing with in the past. It's really hard to decide to have a redundancy in your engineering roadmap.
Do you use the metaphor technical debt very often in your day-to-day work?
Very much, yeah, but I don't use it in the negative way. I think people use it to mean something terrible. And then I ask people like, well, have you bought a house or a car? And, oftentimes they've got a mortgage or some auto loan that they've taken out to buy the car. Well, do you think that mortgage or that auto loan is a bad thing? Not necessarily. It helped you to achieve a goal right now. As long as you're diligent about making sure that that gets paid off, it's certainly worth taking on debt sometimes.
Do you feel like your own thinking around what technical debt is or isn't has evolved over your career? And
Oh yeah, absolutely. As a software engineer, technical debt was absolutely the most evil thing I could imagine, right? And in fact, I'll even add to it and say there's another term for technical debt that gets sort of thrown out there, or maybe it's an adjacent term. They'll call it throwaway work. Right. So you hear somebody saying like, well, I don't want to go build that right now because I'm going to build this other thing later and that should be a part of this. And I don't want to do throwaway work, but why not? Like, what's wrong? In software, we have this amazing luxury to write code, software that can be disposable if we want it to be, right? We can invest a little bit less to capture some value early and still later build a different version of it better if we decide that the value's there. But we have this aversion to doing something twice, or an aversion to not doing something perfect, especially as engineers. We really strive for as close to perfect as we can get, because I think engineers see systems that are very close to perfect as beautiful. I know I do. And I love the aesthetic, both in my mind and on the page of code, of something that is so close to perfect, the perfect number of abstractions that really describe the system. Oh, it's beautiful. But if my competitors have passed me by and shipped a product that was good enough to get all of the customers before I got there, my beautiful thing is now, going to wind up in somebody's poetry book instead of, on a product portfolio where we can actually earn money and pay people salaries.
hey listeners, it's Robbie here. It wasn't all that long ago. I'd find myself debugging a weird issue in one of our clients' Rails apps. I log into one platform to track down the error, only to realize it was tied to some performance issue. And guess what? That meant hopping over into a completely different tool and trying to match things up based off of timestamps, if I was lucky. And let me tell you, my productivity didn't exactly thank me for that. Enter AppSignal, our podcast sponsor, and the tool that eliminates all that back and forth. They bring error tracking, performance monitoring, host metrics, custom metrics, uptime monitoring, and logging into one seamless platform. It's a single source of truth that helps keep your app running like a well-rehearsed symphony. Whether you're working with Ruby, Elixir, Node, Python, or tracking front-end errors in JavaScript, AppSignal has your back. They're always adding support for more languages and frameworks too. And here's the best part. AppSignal won't break the bank. Plans start at just $23 US a month. Plus, they're ISO 27001 certified and fully GDPR and HIPAA compliant, so your data is safe. Oh, and because you're a loyal Maintainable listener, you can use the promo code MAINTAINABLE at checkout for 10% off your first year. So head over to appsignal.com, tell them that your good friend Robbie from Maintainable sent you, and start making your app sing. Right. I think back to earlier in my career around, one of the things when I got introduced to Ruby on Rails and I started using it quite a bit, I found it was just so excited to be able to prototype things really quickly. And I was really for a while, we got really hung up on I'm like, build prototypes, but commit to throwing them away so that you can allow yourself to build your prototypes faster, and knowing that you're not going to keep it around, but like, let's test this idea out and then we'll come back and revisit it. But intentionally throw it away. But I think that a lot of people end up keeping their prototypes around. And they're like, okay, well, how do we add tests now to this thing? And it's like not quite ready, but it's working and we got some traction. And so I think it's like maybe we're calling throwaway code prototypes something different. We have different definitions for them, but I'm like, prototype I think is not supposed to be the thing. It's the the first version, or couple. It's an attempt at something, and it's to see how does this feel, and then go maybe do the thing. But I don't feel like I hear people talk about prototyping in that sort of framing anymore. They're like, look how quickly you can scaffold or build things up, and then you launched your thing. And I'm like, well, is that the best way to approach that? I don't know, but
No, I think that's a good point. I think, and there's been different names for prototypes. I think people use MVP frequently now, and which doesn't mean prototype at all, but it's been leveraged in that way. I think we used to say tracer bullets for those of us who read the Pragmatic Programmer back in the day. But it's funny that you're bringing this up in particular, because I've just started talking about a couple of books that I really like. Some ancient tomes, the Mythical Man Month or the Man Month Myth. I can't remember what that is, but I remember that book had a portion of it written where it was like, build one to throw away. You're gonna throw it away anyway, so like just plan to do that. And then that got referenced again in a later book, The Cathedral and the Bazaar. I think it was by Eric S. Raymond, and kind of has that same sort of phrasing in there. So I'm sure that he pulled it right from the Mythical Man Month book. But it's still true today, right? I mean, the Mythical Man Month was written in 1975, and here we sit and write something now so that we can see if there's some value, with a plan to throw it away once we recognize value, and then go build the thing that actually we feel good about. And the great thing about that is, a lot of stuff we're going to build, we're going to find out isn't that valuable. And if you've over invested in that, or if you've built it in this amazing way and then nobody wants it, you've spent a lot of money on an attempt. So make those cheaper.
I wonder sometimes, because I've been working in the consulting space for a couple of decades now, and it's very different than I imagine what the day-to-day life of working in a product company where you're supporting things. And so by the time our clients come to us with an idea or we want to build this feature, or we want to do this, it already feels like they've already invested a lot of time and energy, and they're like, okay, now we're ready to, for lack of a better word, outsource it to have us build the thing or work on it. And so we don't always get to do a lot of prototyping necessarily, because they're like, we need this thing, and like it seems like you have to kind of take it at face value. I imagine that happens internal at product companies too, where like, well, it's gone through different product teams, what have you, got the plan together, and you're like, are we prototyping just the concept of like what the feature is, or are we prototyping our implementation approach? How do you kind of distinguish that?
Yeah, I think so both things are what you've are what you're trying to figure out in that prototype phase, or in the tracer bullet phase, right? You're trying to figure out whether or not the thing that you're trying to make is going to be valuable. Is somebody going to look at that and be like, ooh, I want that? But you also need to discover whether or not it's feasible, or what is necessary to make it feasible. Because sure, it might be something that people want, but if it costs you $100 a month for the equipment to operate the product, and you're only going to get a handful of people that are willing to pay $10 a month, doing the math, it's like, this might not really work as a product. I have a question for you, especially in the consulting space. Is it often, this is just my imagination, but that like a client has attempted and maybe prototyped a little bit on their own and then found that it was difficult, and the prototype is what leads them to realize, I need the help of an expert, and then they come to you guys?
There's both scenarios. I think for a lot of our clients, we are the engineering team that they work with. They just don't. They have projects that aren't necessarily big enough to warrant having full-time engineers, like a team of engineers. Maybe they've had one or two engineers over a period of time, and they've gone on to get new jobs, or they needed to get a new job somewhere else, and they're like, well, we probably aren't best set up to have a team that's going to be like 2 or 3 plus engineers. So rather than having a string of freelancers, they'll hire us just to be their development team. And so it's kind of how we come into those types of engagements. Otherwise, we come into more of scenarios where they've already gone down the path of building on a bunch of things. Like, we have a lot of different approaches that we're working on in parallel, and we haven't come to an agreement on which approach is going to make the most sense going forward. As we've been adding more people to our team, look at how we're managing our background jobs, or how, and like this just this current path doesn't seem sustainable. I'm just using that as a kind of a recent example, but there's a lot of those types of things. So it's less about coming in and building a lot of new features for those clients. It's more about helping those types of clients that have their engineering teams like make some decisions and kind of pulling together ideas. Or quite often it's just having a lot of isolated conversations with a lot of engineers on those teams and then coming back with recommendations. Like, this is what your team's saying you need to do. You just can't seem to make those decisions on your own as a group. Quite often what we kind of get pulled in for. But I don't know if that quite answers your question entirely.
No, yeah.
So while preparing for this conversation, I learned that during your time at a different company at FlexCar, your team inherited a fleet of over 70 Java microservices. What were some of the challenges that came with maintaining and evolving such a sprawling system?
Oh yeah, that was, and we, I would say inherited is maybe not as accurate as we took it. So FlexCar was a company that we built inside of Zipcar and then spun it out. And so since we were built inside of Zipcar, we sort of built using Zipcar's tech and followed those patterns that were already in place there as we were building. And quite frankly, we were doing exactly what any popular software blog would tell you to do. Like every problem domain gets its own service, and you got to, build them all up in these individual microservices architecture and make sure they're all running in Kubernetes. And the problem that we ended up facing after, about a year and a half of doing that is that operating 70 plus ish microservices takes a lot of engineering effort. It was very expensive. We had to have a dedicated team that was really just focused on operating Kubernetes. That by itself, right, it was several people. And then every service had to be owned by someone somewhere. And so the engineering team was getting larger and larger and larger. And this is a company, after we spun it out of Zipcar, that we were really trying to find our way to make this into a profitable business. It was not at the beginning. It was very far from it. And the real challenge, besides the growing, like a very expensive engineering organization, was it took a long time to get things done that should have been really, really easy. Right. So there's one example that came to my mind, which was we had just launched delivery. So for those who don't know, FlexCar is on the East Coast. It's a car subscription service. So it's a company where you could just pay a monthly fee to have a car, and you can swap your car at any time. So you could have a Jeep in the winter and a car with a drop top in the summer if you want. It's really cool. I'm still a big fan, even though I'm not working there today. But the problem that we had after we launched delivery, which is where we would bring the car to your door so that you could have your FlexCar brought to you, was that we didn't have a good way of showing our client like where that car was, our customer, where the car was on its path to them. We were delivering, 4 or 5 cars at a time, and they were somewhere on that route. Internally, we had this great widget that we could see like where the cars were. Like I could see exactly where anybody's car was if I needed to. And I wanted to make that available to our customer. Like how cool would it be that I could see like, oh, my car is, 3 miles away. Yeah, right. Pretty easy because I know where the data is. I've got a UI component that could be reused. It was this React component. If I could just bring that into our React Native UI and make that available to my customer, no problem. So sat down, kind of worked through it, and was like, all right, this would probably take us, a few days, maybe a week or so to get this done. So I brought it to the team, and instantly it was like, well, we're going to need to get the mobile team and the e-commerce team and the delivery team and the GraphQL team and the inventory team together in order to build this thing. I was like, that sounds like way more than we need, but it was fine. So we got everyone together. It took a few days to schedule where we got all those people in the same place where we could talk. And then we had the conversation, and they were like, okay, well, we'll build out, this is how this system will talk to that system. And before I knew it, I was like, this is going to take like 3 or 4 weeks to do something that back when I was a software developer in the pre-microservices days, like, I remember I was like, I could have done this in like probably an afternoon or maybe a couple of days. I could have at least gotten a prototype. And it just was like, this is crazy. So we started working on it, but that was one of the many sparks in my mind. Is like, we're not doing this right. Like as a company at our age that's trying to rapidly find our footing and become a profitable business so that we can expand and serve more people who need this kind of mobility, why is it taking us so long? Why are we paying this heavy price? So I actually started on the path of trying to find a solution. Rails came to mind because I used Rails way back in the day, like when Rails was brand new. And I used it for some contract projects and things like that. And so I remembered working with it, and I remembered loving how like kind of everything was in the box and I could just get stuff done. But it had been a long time, so I tried out a bunch of things. I tried a prototype with Elixir and Phoenix, which is kind of what I thought was going to win, honestly, in my little test. I did the Laravel thing, I did a Next.js thing, Django. I have a lot of history with Python and Flask, and so I did Django and a couple of other frameworks. And and Rails was almost towards the end, and I was like, wow, like this is still really great. Like this is still like everything is in the box, and it was even better than I remembered because it was, I think, Hotwire and Stimulus had kind of become a little bit more fleshed out by the time I was trying it. It was pretty like out of the box, ready to go reactive solution. So I thought I was onto something there. So, but I wasn't sure yet. And I started telling my engineering team, I was like, look, we're going to change. We're going to re-architect. And I know how you feel about rebuilding. I know. But I think maybe if you've got 70 Java microservices, maybe it's time to think about it. So I started telling the team that. I remember the guy who was leading engineering for the US at the time said, as long as it ain't Ruby, if it's Ruby, I'm going to hang myself, is what he said. And I was like, oh boy. I flew out to India to hang out with our engineering team there, and I pulled 3 guys into a room and I said, we're working on a secret project. We're going to try in the next 3 days to rebuild FlexCar as close as we can with Ruby on Rails. And these guys were not into it at all. But they were like, hey, this is what the boss wants to do. Impressively, of course, in 3 days, we did not rebuild FlexCar. That's ridiculous to assume, but, wanted to put a stretch goal down. But in 3 days, we did have some pieces that were really impressive. And one of the things that really got me that was there was a guy who was this back-end developer. His name was Upendra. And he was like as good of a back-end Java software developer as you could ever want. Like he was phenomenal. And he shows me at the end of one of the days, he was like, hey, look at this. And he opens up his laptop and he's clicking around on this UI. I'm like, yeah, that's great. And then I don't realize at first why he's so excited. And then I suddenly realize he's using Hotwire. Like this guy had never written any front end code in his whole career. And he's got like a reactive UI with Hotwire that's doing partial page re-rendering. And he's like, look what I did. And I didn't even try Ruby before 2 days ago. And now look what I'm doing. And that told me, I was like, okay, there's magic here still. Like this is worth doing. So I went back to the States and, I told the guy who told me that he would hang himself if we were using Ruby that he needed to get some rope because we were, we were making the switch. I know it's a really grim metaphor, but he's the one who came up with it. So he said, all right, well, if this is what we're doing, then fine. Like I'm on board. And we pulled a small group together and we started work in mid-January with a goal to be done by originally end of March or something like that. And we weren't quite done then, but we spent a little bit more time getting it polished. And we ended up rebuilding all of FlexCar in 4 months and launching. Our launch date, because of the pushbacks, ended up lining up actually with that RailsConf that where you and I met for the first time. So yeah, that was completely unintentional and highly do not recommend at all launching at RailsConf because you want to enjoy the show and not be up all night. But it was phenomenal. And the approach we took worked really well for us. We started with a really small group. We printed out every screen we could find in the existing system. I pinned them to the wall and I said, each screen is going to have somebody's name attached to it. And their job is to make sure that all the functionality behind whatever the screen is exists as well as the screen. We started out with a group of 4 people, and then after a week, we added another person, and over the course of those months, we added the rest of the engineering org. Now here, FlexCar is doing fantastic, by the way. And of course, they can tell the story better than me about how they're doing, but they are on Rails and the team is fully converted. And now there's a team of very passionate Ruby developers where just before this project, I think most folks had not seen Ruby except for maybe some college projects.
That's impressive. We talked a little bit about this when we met up in Detroit there, but something that's kind of like sits in my mind about the idea of, the rewrite versus a refactor, or when does it make sense? During that process, were you aiming for feature parity? And that's what you mentioned, like having all the printouts of all the different screens, or were you able to cut some stuff out during that process as well?
Yeah, we definitely cut scope. Yeah, I think if you're going to do something like this, you're not doing yourself any favors if you try to expand on the capabilities at the same time. And in fact, it's your best opportunity ever to say, what is somebody not really using that we could remove from this thing? So we definitely cut a bunch of things out where we just didn't see usage in the system and figured we could add if we needed to.
Did you end up with 70 Ruby microservices, or did that all
gone? Yeah, we ended up in the end with a single monolithic Ruby on Rails application, and it had two front ends, one front end for the administrative use case, for internal use case, and then the front end that you would see today if you go to flexcar.com. That was actually built using a mixture of React and Remix, with the Rails monolith serving as sort of the API layer there. But the internal facing UI was entirely built using Hotwire and Stimulus facing the internal client.
You had mentioned that, giving that example where you're like, hey, maybe we can do this, implement this new. We want to take this idea that we can use over, one idea, we want to put it in the mobile app, and you're like, we pulled together some teams, and all of a sudden, like a half a week project seemed like it was going to take 3 weeks. All of a sudden, how did you rethink the team structure through that transition process? Now, were you able to, as a company, were they able to get to a point where now there's better shared ownership of the whole on a macro level, or do you still have these different teams? Because you also had that example of like, look at the backend engineer that's like, look what I was able to do, kind of like excited in a way. I'm like, I haven't got to really ever do any front end stuff in maybe forever, and so, but there's also probably people on your team that's been their specialty, and they're like, I don't know about the back end stuff. And so there are other types of dynamics that kind of come into play there that are not necessarily just technical.
Yeah, so there's a bunch in there. I'll start with the what happened to the team structure. And what happened was we ended up with engineering teams of one, maybe two people. So when we needed to do something, almost anything that we wanted to do. So for example, the adding the delivery widget into the mobile app was a thing that could be done by a single engineer after we were done. Now, not any engineer, right? Because we had some React Native that was needed for the mobile app, so you had to have some ability to work in that environment. But that one person who had that was able to go and do everything to solve their backend problems too. In fact, that was one of the biggest discoveries and probably one of the greater shocks to me, was that the team that was empowered the most first were those folks who had previously been called UI developers or front-end developers on the team. Those folks became super effective right away because they were able to continue leveraging their front end skill set, but now the entire world of back end, everything between them and the database was now available. And they found Ruby to be incredibly approachable, unlike Java had been for them previously. But so what it turned into, and by the way, the backend developers did start building up this front end skill set as well. It was crystal clear from an early time, though, that the backend developers working with the built-in Rails views were more effective than when we asked them to go start working with React stuff. React is another way of building, another way of thinking, and so it has its own learning curve that you've got to pick up. And I think that Rails views comes fairly naturally in the paradigm of web application development from a backend point of view. So, but it wasn't impossible anymore for one person to solve the entire problem. That sped us up tremendously. In fact, we went from shipping a major feature every month or 2 months to shipping, multiple major features within a week, every week. It was just this constant shipping, and the team felt incredible about being able to do it. Of course, I felt really good. I went back to writing code for a while, which I loved getting. I've never stopped, but like writing code that went into our production environment was kind of a cool thing to get a chance to do again, because suddenly it was possible for me to do that kind of work again.
We'll be back with our interview with Freedom in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robbie. I want to take a quick moment to say thank you for making time to listen to the podcast. If you're finding these discussions valuable, please consider sharing a link amongst your peers. You can drop a link to this episode right in your Slack channel, your Teams channel, or wherever your kids are hanging out with your coworkers these days, and or writing a review on Apple Podcast or Spotify. Also, if you know someone in the industry you think I should have on the podcast someday, shoot me an email to robbie@maintainable.fm and state your case. And now, let's get back to our interview with Freedom Dumlao. So now, you transition and now you're the CTO at Vestmark, where you're working with this 20-year-old Java monolith, right? And managing like a $1.6 trillion in assets, I believe there. So that sounds like it could be a massive system there. So what's some of the kind of the daunting challenges that you're working on with your team there, if you can share, at that answer?
Ideally, our client base and our clients continue to do better. And as they do better, then our system needs to continue to scale to support larger and larger trading volumes. And that gets harder once you hit a certain scale, once you hit a certain size, right? And our system has a lot of moving parts in it. We do everything from rebalancing, we manage trades, we do reconciliation. These are all complex processes that consume quite a lot of memory and disk resources. They tap databases out fairly quickly. And so a system like this, you're always looking for that next place where you can add some ability to stretch it so it can support, even more for our clients. That's where we see the biggest challenge. The other challenge we've got, though, is this product is a well-established product. It's in the market. It's been around for 20 years. We've got some amazing and impressive clientele that I don't know that I'm at liberty to name them. Hopefully there's some logos on the website. If not, we'll see what I can share later. But we'd also like to grow this business and go after other clients as well with new products. And it doesn't make a lot of sense for us to transform our current product to go serve some new customer in some new way. That's going to water down what our current product can do. It's going to add to the complexity of managing it. And so we need to go find these new customers with new products, and we need to be able to build and rapidly determine whether or not these new products are going to be valuable so that we don't overinvest. So for me, again, the tool I'm reaching for there is Ruby and Rails. So we just started using Ruby and Rails this year. So we've got a small team that I pulled together, very similar to what we did at FlexCar, and said, hey, we've got this thing we need to build. We're going to build it with this toolkit. Normally it takes us 2 years to launch a product here at Vestmark, and I want us to launch in a month. Let's see if we can do it. We started work on it in January, and we launched, we were done with work in a month, but we actually launched, I would say officially 43 days after we started working on it and put it in the hands of the first customer who was able to use it. It was a huge victory and really showed that it's possible for us to create new products and get them in the hands of customers so we can find out if they're valuable using this technology, even though we're, a 20-year-old company that's also got a Java monolith that we support as well.
That makes sense. I'm curious, we don't have to go into specifics there necessarily, but when you say like a product, is this can you tell us a little bit about like what that is? What does the product look like? Is this a research tool that your customers can use to like kind of play out some scenarios with assets, or
yeah, which that sounds very cool, by the way, and we do have stuff like that actually, but no, that's not what I was talking about.
Because I've worked on projects like that in the past, and in the financial space as well, and it's been a while. But
I'd love to talk to you about that stuff too, then, because that's become very interesting to me lately. So Vestmark's primary product really was originally built for trading departments at some of the largest asset management firms that you can imagine, right? So just imagine these great big behemoth asset management firms. They've got back office trading rooms where there's people whose job is all day to like manage and trade your portfolios and your accounts. And at the other end of that is the person that you and I would interact with in the investment relationship, your financial advisor. Vestmark is a fine tool for financial advisors, but it's very much an expert tool with a million options and bells and whistles that you can tweak to customize and manage it. And some financial advisors would rather not spend all of their time doing that. They've got other work that they want to be able to do, and they want to focus on, growing their portfolio, putting together proposals, and all of the other tasks that are part of the advisor role. So we've been working on building new capabilities that are specifically targeted at enhancing the lives of the everyday financial advisor. So you'll see some of those things coming out. We've got a great tax loss harvesting product called Vast that's out in the marketplace today. And we've got this new Vestmark Advisor product that we recently showed off at T3. And for us, that's two things. Number one, it's a UI experience that is custom built for an advisor to use. But it's also, we've started building out AI capabilities. So we don't have like a science team that's like inventing our own models, but we're leveraging what now is available to us to build agentic systems that can basically give a financial advisor more horsepower, something that they can actually do better that they couldn't do before. And so that's the stuff that we've been working on in the new product.
That's interesting. Yeah, I'll include links to your folks' website, and then people can go look at it. It sounds like most of what that would be, like your advisors, the advisors there are part of your staff, and your clients and customers are kind of interacting with them. It sounds like, or advisors.
Well, it wouldn't be our staff. Yeah, they'd be like our customers' staff. Yes, that's right. Yeah. So our customers will have financial advisors, and those financial advisors would get access to these tools.
I also know that you're, coming back to code a little bit. So you mentioned that, prepping for this conversation, I know that you're starting to leverage AI tools, not just, obviously sounds like you're building some, but you're also leveraging them to help your team better understand and document the code base. Can you share how that's working in practice and what you're learning from that approach?
Yeah, I'll tell you, number one, AI tools, once you understand where the boundaries are and what the limitations are, huge accelerants. They can definitely help you to skip ahead, especially when you're embracing and learning a new technology. So the folks on the team who are using, say, Cursor as they're learning Rails are more productive than somebody who's like flipping back and forth between, the YouTube video or the books. Like they're just getting some suggestions that are fairly reasonable, it looks like these days. But you got to know where the hallucinations might pick up and be prepared for that, or also be prepared for when it starts wrecking your code base because the context window is getting drowned out. So those are things we watch out for. My experience with using it to help us document our code, it's a really fascinating space because it's possible now for a system to generate a bunch of embeddings and record the state of your code. I don't know if you're familiar with this concept of RAG, or retrieval augmented generation. But what that is it'll take some data or text or whatever, break it up into small numerical chunks, and then store that for you, and then offer that data up as a resource for a large language model to go and pull from. So then I go and say, like, hey Claude, I'm working in the rebalancer, or give me some, a test for my rebalancer. It doesn't have to have the whole rebalancer code base in context. It can go and pull that from the retrieval augmented generation system just in time based on that rebalancer keyword. So that's changing what's possible in terms of understanding code now, but turning that into human readable documentation is still pretty far away. And what I've noticed is, especially in a system like ours, where there is a lot of, I don't like using the word legacy, honestly. I think it's not because I think it's a bad word, but because some people get the wrong idea when they hear it, the same way they do with technical debt. But our software has dependencies on open source projects that go way back, and those are some of those projects are long since dead, and nobody is using them, and so we've just sort of absorbed them like you can with an open source project and made it a part of our code base. But the large language models haven't been trained on these older code bases, right? They're trained on what's currently available in, say, GitHub or what's on Stack Overflow. So when these models see our code, it's like it doesn't immediately figure out like what it's dealing with, and instead it comes up with a very generous idea about what the thing is. Like it'll say like, oh, this is. I'll give you a great example. Our UI is made for people in these back office trading scenarios, and they're sitting at a desk with a big, a big giant monitor, and so we have never invested at all in making that be a responsive UI because there's no world in which that person doing that job puts that thing onto a mobile phone. It just isn't, it wouldn't make sense. But when we use these large language models to try to give us some insight into our code, they'll do things like pick up on the fact that, hey, you got a little bit of React in here and you got a style sheet that has the responsive flag set somewhere. Your system is a fully responsive system that, it'll say these things like, oh, sure wish it was that way, but not exactly. So we're seeing that, but because we're learning that now, we're turning that around and saying, okay, now, like, how do we refine the way that we ask these things to make inferences about the code? And we're getting better and better results. And so hopefully what we're learning is something that, the greater world will be able to learn from in the future once we've got this mastered.
One of the critiques I've heard of, I'm trying to remember which project it was. I feel like there was a pretty reputable web platform in the last, it's coming to mind, but I'm not going to name them out necessarily. But they had originally built a lot of their platform with Ruby on Rails and were intentionally going down the, I think, Node rep path, and I forget what they were going to be using, because they felt like they could better leverage the LLM tools because there's just more code written in JavaScript or whatever. And does that concern you at all, or is that something you're thinking about as you're taking advantage of Ruby on Rails, or do you feel like that's just going to be an issue that will be rectified in the next not too near future anyways?
I think it's a really good point. And in fact, I think one of those systems is, so a good friend of mine is, he had a post on LinkedIn. He's creating a labs department at his company. And he is a big fan of Ruby going back as far as you can imagine. And it kind of broke his heart that he came to the conclusion that he needed to choose a JavaScript stack because what he saw was building stuff with large language models was going to be the way that this labs team was going to be the most effective. And the Ruby code that was generated was just not very good compared to the JavaScript code. And he's right. Like if you write any code using a large language model, you will find that JavaScript and Python by far are so well represented in the available code that you are going to get a big leap forward if those are the programming languages you're choosing. Now, what I've seen personally and what we've seen is that while that is true, the initial leap forward is certainly greater in a shorter amount of time. You do hit a point at which a human being has to take over and start driving. The vibe coding thing only gets you so far until the context window can't support. And once the human being is there and operating and manipulating the code base, are they in a position to be as effective as possible? And so while, yes, it's true, I think using Ruby today is going to mean that you're going to get a little bit less of an advantage from the large language models. As soon as the human being portion of the work kicks in, all of the advantage is in Ruby's court, 100% of it, because there is not, and I'm not saying this as a person who just loves Ruby, although I am. Objectively speaking, it's very hard to beat Ruby in terms of human productivity in software development. It's literally designed with that in mind. And to me, that's much more valuable to be investing in. And so that's why we're making the choice still to use Ruby on Rails. And I think it's a short-term problem, right? I think that the Ruby code bases that get to be available to large language models that are training are going to become more numerous. And eventually these large language models will be fine at producing great Ruby code. One other insight I had on that, actually, by the way, that I was thinking about is that Ruby code bases tend to be smaller. And I wondered if the fact that a Ruby code base tends to be smaller, on top of the fact that there just are fewer of them, out there in the wild, is maybe partially why the large language models don't have as much, to chew on as they're trying to train themselves. But
hey folks, it's Robbie here. I want to share a quick story. We just had a big kickoff call with one of our newer clients, and afterward, I got a LinkedIn message from one of the engineers on their team. He said, "Hey, I've been listening to the podcast, subscribed to one of your newsletters for a while, and I was actually the one who mentioned Planet Argon to our stakeholders like 6 months ago. And now we're working together." In the world of running a software consultancy like ours, that kind of thing means the world to our team. So if you're a developer at a company who's got big, ambitious goals this year, but not quite ready to commit to full-time hires, we'd love to help. We offer staff augmentation and fractional development services for teams that need to move fast without locking in long-term. We work with Ruby on Rails, React, Laravel, and more. If this sounds like something your manager should know about, send them our way. PlanetArgon.com. Again, that's PlanetArgon.com. All right, let's get back to the show. Yeah, that's interesting. I've kind of like an interesting thing and be like, oh, well, you can have like this niche thing, and then but like, oh, it's kind of like this is kind of we're a little bit at odds with the two, and it's just like, oh, this is great. We also don't have a lot to share in the same sort of way, and there's not as many examples and blog posts and articles and Stack Overflow questions that are related to this and so it's like we've kind of prided ourselves on being like not necessarily the number one thing, the most popular thing, but then it's like what's going to get cloned the most or most crawled the most. So it's interesting. Yeah.
Another thing on the, not Ruby specifically, but Rails that I've brought up in a couple of these discussions is that, what are we using large language models for when we're coding? It's really generating the initial scaffolding in which our application is going to live. And
which Rails gives us.
Exactly right? So Rails already has that. Like I can already chat to Rails and say, hey, generate me a controller or generate me this model. Obviously, it's not in human language, but I've already, as a Rails developer, had access to the ability to generate the majority of my working CRUD application without any, without having to actually start writing code. So it's kind of fascinating. Rails has this. So the fact that you're looking at Rails in this way, you got to kind of take into account what's built into Rails. Kind of maybe makes it so you don't need the LLM in the same way that you would in a Python or JavaScript app.
It's interesting. Thanks for highlighting. I think that's a good counterpoint to that. I had a couple of other quick questions here. I know that you mentioned that you're opinionated about Yagni and the idea of seeking feedback instead of consensus. Could you unpack that for us?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I think we talked a little bit earlier about the idea of, not spending too much time building something if you don't know whether or not there's going to be value. And Yagni stands for you ain't going to need it or you aren't going to need it. And this is this goes, way back to the extreme programming days. I think was where it was first. I don't know if it was Kent Beck that first said it or maybe it was somebody else in that time frame. And the idea is that you don't really know yet where the value is going to be. And it's very easy to get lost in the weeds and start exploring the what ifs. Like, well, what if my customer decides that they also, want to pack a swimsuit in their suitcase? Okay, great. We'll add a pocket for swimsuit. Well, what if they also want to bring a camera, a tripod? Okay, I guess we'll add that on. And you keep adding on little features to your hypothetical suitcase here until suddenly you've got an unwieldy thing that costs a lot of money to make and manufacture, and you haven't figured out if anyone even wants to buy it. So I encourage engineers on my team, spend your time focusing on just what's necessary so that we can prove the value, and then we'll take the next step to determine if we need to add more. Because so often, in my embarrassingly long career, I've built software that I was really proud of that nobody wanted. So, you don't want to overinvest that way. The second thing you mentioned there, seek feedback, not consensus. This I learned when I was working at Drift, and I don't know who coined it. I think it was David Cancel came up with it, or somebody on his team. But the idea is when you're making a decision, somebody's got to own the decision ultimately. And if that's you, then your job is to come to a conclusion. The natural tendency of nice people is to get everyone on the same page and to get everyone to agree. And number one, that rarely happens, right? It almost never happens that everyone will agree unless some concessions are made. And number two is once those concessions start being made, you are automatically gravitating towards like the lukewarmest version of whatever the thing is that you're owning the decision about, instead of the the extreme or the interesting or the compelling or the different, you're sort of gravitating towards the sort of the mixture of ideas until you get this like lukewarm version of it. So what I tell people is don't try to get everyone to agree on the thing. It's okay. You still want their feedback. Go talk to people who you trust, whose feedback you respect. Incorporate that into your thinking, but then you own the decision. Make that decision. It'll lead to faster decision making every time, guaranteed. And you're going to get to, if whether the decision is right or wrong, you don't even know until after it's been made. The sooner you make that decision, you'll find out if you were right or wrong, and you can find out if it's time to pivot or change to maybe a different direction. So it's a much better and more effective way to be an owner, especially in a decision-making process. So seek feedback, not consensus. It's an important part of how I like to lead with my teams.
I appreciate you digging into that, and I think it's good timing for me to hear that. But also for our listeners out there who might not be the decision maker, but maybe they're part of a team right now. So maybe could you offer them some advice on how to navigate that, or to work with different teams, or conversations, or just getting like people ask to have a half-hour conversation with me, and they're like, we're dealing with these weird things, and like doesn't seem like anyone's ready to make a decision on this thing, or they're not, like, we don't know, and I can just feel people like feeling a little frustrated waiting for something to happen. And for those people that are listening that are not maybe the go-to decision maker, but feel like maybe they have an opinion about something, but they kind of would like to do something rather than keep hoping that one day the right decision is going to be like everybody's going to come together and like we all agree that we're all on the same page, right? And what kind of advice can you offer to them on how they can take some action and or maybe encourage the decision maker to make a decision?
Yeah, I think it's great. So first of all, I would say call out if not everyone is at a point in their career or has the emotional comfort to be able to call something out or call somebody out. So I don't expect that everyone's going to be able to do that right away. But to the extent that you're capable of, when you see that sort of waning decision making thing, saying it out loud has an incredible impact on people recognizing it, because people are feeling it, right? People in a group where a decision needs to be made, but the decision isn't being made. Everyone starts to get that nagging sort of anxious feeling of like, well, what's next? So literally just saying out loud, okay, who owns this decision? Who's going to be the final decision maker here? And if it's like, oh, we're not sure, it's like, all right, well, I nominate X because I trust them and they've done blah, blah, blah. Be the nominator. Sometimes that can unbreak it. Sometimes nominate yourself is an okay move. Say like, hey, since we're not really sure who's going to pull the trigger on this thing, is it okay if I just make the call on this? I'll incorporate everything we heard here. And that's another way to move it forward. The other advice I'm going to give is, if you're the feedback giver, be a feedback giver and don't feel particularly precious about your feedback. It's important that you get an opportunity to share your feedback, but if the end result and the end decision isn't in line with what your feedback was sort of suggesting, that's okay. Like, that's totally fine. Don't take it personally. It has nothing to do with you as a human being. It has everything to do with whoever the decision maker is. They've got a lot to think about, and you gave them something valuable, and then they still had to make a decision in the end. And so be a good feedback giver, which means share honestly and accept when your feedback it doesn't steer the direction the way that you hoped. That's okay.
I like that. Do you feel like there's a way that people could be better about? I mean, it sounds like you've been in I'm air quoting leadership position for quite a while now. And have you seen good examples of people of like, they've given you feedback that might be counter to the decision you end up being made, but they've been able to come to you and be like, I understand this isn't in line with what I wanted, but I fully support this decision, or I'm on board with you. How do you kind of like communicate that so that there's not feeling like there's like this weird little like unspoken rift of like, I told you this was going to happen, or and like it's complicated on both sides of that. I understand.
Great example of that, by the way. Did I mention earlier that I had to convince an engineering team that we were shifting from 70 Java microservices to Ruby on Rails? But if you're the decision maker, if you're the decision owner, you've got to be a grateful feedback receiver too, right? Getting feedback, especially candid, honest feedback, is really a gift. And the way that you can be grateful is to specifically acknowledge it, especially acknowledging the feedback that it maybe isn't going to be the feedback that leads you to the decision that the feedback giver was hoping to get you to. So just say like, There was a person on my team who didn't think that migrating to Ruby on Rails was a very good idea. They had used Ruby at a place before, and they didn't see my vision of how it was going to work out. And I told him, a man named Arnab, who I love and still have a great relationship with. I said, Arnab, I hear what you're saying. Totally think this feedback is great. And I think what you learned was that Ruby on Rails doesn't work. And what I heard from that is here's the context on why it wasn't working well for you. So I'm going to continue with this objective. We're going to go ahead and move forward with building our Ruby on Rails app. But thanks to your feedback, I know some pitfalls that I'm going to avoid. Thank you for that. And just showing the gratitude there and making sure that the door was open to keep getting feedback, and that just because I wasn't taking his, what was really advice in this case, that I wanted him to know that I still wanted to hear more in the future. So.
That's great. All right. So a couple of quick last questions for you. Is there a non-software, non-coding, non-technical book that you find yourself recommending to peers?
I could only narrow it down to two. I tried to narrow it down to one, but I'm narrowing it down to two because I read a lot. I almost always have 3 books going, usually something that's programming or code or something related, something that's business or career objectives related, and something that is fiction, like sci-fi or fantasy or whatever. So I'm going to give first a business career sort of one. It's a book called No Rules Rules, and it's about the culture at Netflix. And I think it is a fascinating peek inside of a very successful organization that is known for this culture of, and it's not because it's my name that I love it, but they have this culture of freedom and responsibility that they talk about. And it's a way in which you can empower the people who work on your teams to fully own the majority of their work and their jobs and their outcomes and their deliverables. And if companies are able to embrace even a portion of what I think is in that book, and I say companies because of the role that I'm in right now, but I think it's actually valuable even for, say, a software engineer or a UX designer or a young salesperson to read and understand what's possible, because everyone has some amount of influence that they can exert in this way. Understanding what makes freedom and responsibility possible at a company like Netflix can really help us all, I think, to understand how to get some portion of that available to ourselves. And the thing I'll advise people not to get hung up on, Netflix is a very successful and extremely profitable company. So some of the things that they talk about in there is, paying ridiculously high salaries and extremely generous severance packages. And what I've seen companies do is they start reading this book and they're like, well, we can't afford that. And they dismiss the rest of the book. And it's like, please, the book is not about the fact that Netflix is very rich, although they are. Skip past that and don't get hung up on it if you're going to read that book. The second one I'm going to suggest is a book series called Dungeon Crawler Carl, because it's hilarious. And if you like the kinds of nerdy fantasy science fiction things that I like, that book series is just so much fun. I read through all 7 books probably in the last, 8 months. And and somebody said there's going to make a TV show out of it. So if you like fun books that are goofy and have a sort of there's a bit of an adult edge in them, though. So, not for our younger listeners today, but I definitely highly recommend that series. It's a lot of fun. I think that's by Matt Dinneman as the author there.
Great. I'll definitely include links to both of those in the show notes, and I have to check those out myself. I've heard of the Netflix one before, but yeah, there's a Dungeon Crawler Carl.
That's right. Yeah. And the audiobook is the best, in my opinion. The audiobook is the best way to experience it. They've got amazing production. It's so fun. Anyway.
Well, great. And where can listeners best follow your thoughts and ruminations about software engineering online?
I am API guy just about everywhere you can imagine. So you can find me on X and Blue Sky and GitHub for some old code. We'll get some new stuff in there. Got something fresh in the Ruby space that hopefully it will exist before the next 2 weeks go by. So
excellent. Well, it's been such a delight having you join us on Maintainable Freedom. Thank you so much for stopping by to talk shop with us.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie. It was great being on. Great getting a chance to catch up with you.
You've been listening to Maintainable, a Planet Argon production. Editing by Claudia Armbruster. Post-production by Autumn Morgan and Ellis Fenson. Emotional support from the letter M. For Maintainable, for momentum, for making things better. If this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Keep showing up. See you next time. oh, 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 oh.